Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me this week. Last week, if you remember, we talked about sin and its reversals. Well, this week, we want to talk about God, the God of the Bible, and His great reversals. Remember how sin changes everything that was good into bad. It reverses God's good creation. In Genesis 1:31, God looked over everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. Well, sin entered the picture, and that all was turned upside down. So what did God do about that? I want to begin by sharing with you a couple of examples of God's great reversal, how time and time again we observe how God reverses things in the Scriptures to benefit His people and to benefit His glory, that His name may be glorified in heaven and on earth. I want to begin by sharing with you the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph really begins in Genesis 37 and goes all the way through Genesis 50, the final chapter in Genesis. And Joseph's life really begins at 17, at least what we see of him in the Bible. At 17 years of age, he is hated by his brothers. They want to kill him. They eventually decide that they will instead sell him into Egyptian slavery, and they do. And Joseph finds himself down in Egypt, and there seems to be a silver lining to all of this. But Potiphar's wife, Joseph's Commander Potiphar, his wife, wants to commit adultery with Joseph. And Joseph says, I'm not going to do it. He refuses, but she kept on pursuing him. And on a particular occasion, she seized him by his tunic, and she sought to sleep with him. But Joseph ran away, and for that he is thrown into prison. She falsely accuses him, and he is thrown into prison. And then after that, while in prison, Joseph helps two guys. He helps out two Egyptian men who are troubled by their circumstances, and they need some reassurance, and Joseph gives them the help that they need, but one of the guys forgets him, unfortunately. Now, imagine as a 17-year-old for 13 years, he went through these things for 13 years. For 13 years, you go through these three major trials. What is your outcome of life at this point? I mean, are you really thinking about things getting better? How optimistic are you at this point? I mean, that's a legitimate question to ask. Well, I want to tell you this, friends. In Genesis 41, Joseph's life was going to change for good finally. And it was going to remain that way. Because Joseph was faithful to God. And the Bible tells us that if we draw closer to God, He will draw closer to us. And that's what Joseph did. Despite those trials, despite however bad his circumstances were, he was going to cling to his God. And that's exactly what happened. And guess what? At 17, Joseph finds himself in a pit. And at the age of 30, he finds himself the second in command in all of Egypt. He is second only to Pharaoh. In fact, Pharaoh tells him, you're basically me. In other words, we're not going to do anything without your permission and your advice. But just so you know, you're one, I'm two. Essentially, Joseph goes from a point of death to the highest exaltation in all of Egypt, which was the greatest nation on earth at the time. That is, my friends, a great picture of God's reversal. Here's a second picture in the book of Jonah. In Jonah, we find the prophet of God running away from the work that he was supposed to be doing. And he gets on a boat, and there's a great storm. Some of you may know this story well. And Jonah's solution to this storm is that the Gentile men throw him into the ocean. And they did. They threw him into the sea. And can you imagine? You're thrown into the sea, and this is a major storm. There's a 99.999% probability that you're going to die. You're going to end up dead. Well, the Bible tells us that God rescued Jonah from the depths of Sheol. And that phrase, that word Sheol, is often used in the Old Testament to refer to the grave. Jonah was as good as dead. I mean, he probably thought he was as good as dead. But it was not impossible for God to raise him up from that point. And He brought him back on dry land with the aid of a great fish that swallowed Jonah for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he was back on dry land. Another picture of God's great reversal. A situation that was as good as dead is turned into life, which leads me to our third and final point, and the greatest reversal that you will ever see in the Bible, that we will ever hear of in history, and that we will ever get to appreciate in all of human history. And friends, that is the death and resurrection of Jesus our Lord. In Acts chapter 2, when Peter is preaching on the day of Pentecost, he begins in Acts chapter 2 in verse 23, and he says this, speaking of Jesus, to the Jews who crucified him. Listen to what he says. This man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross. By the hands of godless men, you put him to death. Peter said there's no going around that. That's a fact. We all know you guys killed him. Verse 24, but God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for death to hold him by its power. The Jews wanted to kill Jesus. They wanted to get rid of Jesus. Why? Because they thought that he was attracting too much attention to himself. They were frankly envious and jealous that Jesus was getting as much attention as he was. It wasn't the guy they were looking for, frankly. And they wanted to get rid of him. He was just bad news for the Jews and their religious leaders. And so they crucified him, Peter says. But guess what? God had other plans. And he reversed the course of what they did. Death is the final thing that we always allude to. I mean, the idea of somebody coming back from the dead is next to impossible in the minds of all human beings on this earth. And to realize that God can do that is to suggest that there's nothing God cannot do. That, my friends, is the greatest picture of reversal in the Bible and in all of human history. And if God can do that, then there's nothing that he cannot do, which means he can save us and he can bring us with him to heaven. And he uses the resurrection to accomplish that medium. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that we will all be raised just as Jesus was if we put our trust and our hope in God. So sin, yes, turns everything from good into bad, but God had a plan in order that Jesus would reverse the course of that sin, and he would put everything back to where it belongs as a new creation, and behold, everything is good. So if you have not put your trust and your hope in Jesus Christ, you need to do that. And until you do that, then you are still experiencing the consequences and pain of sin. I hope, friends, that this was encouraging to you and that you will continue to study the Scriptures with us and join us every week. Thank you for being with us.